Hey guys, Luke here. Welcome back to another video. Today is going to be week 2 of building Scarif in Lego, and we're going to be focusing on the landing pad today and using the snot technique, which is the studs not on top technique. And I'm going to be explaining what that is later in the video, and I'm going to start the video with the time lapse. But before I do, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and let's get into it. So to start the video, I'm going to be doing a time lapse of prepping the 2 base plates of where the landing pad's actually going to go. As you can see, I'm starting just by placing down tiles and then building up the mills plates around where the sand's going to go. Now I'm starting to build the landing pad using a snot technique, and I'm going to explain what that is later. And I'm just getting the outline so I have an idea of the scale to use. Here you can see the fully prepped base plates and the beginnings of the landing pad. I'm building the landing pad in snot, which means studs not on top. And basically that is, instead of building the bricks up like you normally would, you're building them on their side. And that gives you the opportunity to add a lot more detail. And that's why I'm using this technique, because this landing pad requires a lot of intricate details. And I'm hoping to capture that using the snot technique. Now that you've seen what I've got going on here, let's continue the landing pad in the next time lapse. In this time lapse, I'm going to be continuing to flesh out the sides of the landing pad, as well as work on the top and what I'm going to call the neck of the landing pad, as you'll see later. The reason why I'm doing this is because I want to create a firm foundation and outline to give myself a sense of direction as to where I'm going, because the middle of the landing pad is so tricky to capture since there's a lot of hard angles and lines that need to be built. And that's the reason I'm making this snot, because it makes everything easier. Here is what we have done so far, and I would say this is a pretty solid foundation for the beginnings of the landing pad. As you can see, I stuck in some triangle cheese slopes there and I connected them, and those aren't attached to anything. Those are there because in the picture of the landing pad, which I'll show on screen now, as you can see, there's these corner like slope angles that are really difficult to capture otherwise, so cheese slopes were my best option. And now I have the neck of the landing pad done, and I didn't include this in a time lapse because it was blurry, but as you could see, all the details in there. And yeah, I think this is a really solid start, and I'm really excited to keep going. So that being said, let's move into the next time lapse. The first half of this time lapse is going to be focusing on capturing the angle within those top corners. That's the biggest challenge in this video, because that is what determines how I build the rest of the landing pad. And I really wanted to make this the best it could possibly look, so I spent a lot of time carefully trying to figure this out. As you could see, I'm trying to put in different slopes on different angles right now, but nothing was working. Later in this time lapse, I ended up taking apart the sides completely to rebuild them to match the angles as they are in the middle. This is important because everything has to be symmetrical in order to make everything in the platform fit together really snug. And that is why the angles on the sides and middle determine how the rest of the landing pad is going to be built, because everything in this landing pad needs to be symmetrical. Initially, I started out just by building slopes on their side, but that wasn't working, so I switched to turning the slopes facing outward from that angle. And I initially started with the 1x2 slope, but then that wasn't working for me, so I switched to the 1x2x2 slope, and that also wasn't working for me. And when I looked back at the reference material, I saw that the space between the light gray lines was best represented with the 1x2 dark gray slope. So I switched back to that and used that for the final product. After a while, I needed a break from trying to figure out the angle, so I just went back to building up the middle section. And once I figured that out, I went back to trying to figure out the angle. With a lot of experimentation, I just realized I had to rebuild the sides because the angle of the sides wasn't matching up with the angle in the middle. And this was because I built them in 2 different ways. The angles on the sides ended up being built inwards, whereas the angles in the middle ended up being built outwards towards the end of the MOC. And this was a problem because they didn't line up, and they caused gaps in certain areas, as well as exposing 3 extra studs on the sides. And so to fix that, I ended up just having to rebuild the entire thing to save time and make it easier, and it looked a lot nicer in the end. So as you can see from the time lapse, I had to rebuild these 2 sides because they were built inwards initially, so I had to use snot bricks to get them to face inwards again, and I had to rebuild them so they're coming out this way just like the center is. That was because they were misaligned initially, and so it ended up that these studs here, like 2 or 3 studs back here, were exposed when these weren't, and so they weren't lined up, and it looked really off and uneven. So this looks so much better, and I'm very excited to keep going. So let's get into the next time lapse. Now that I got the sides done, I decided to start working on the details in the middle of the platform, and that just included figuring out the measurements for the squares, figuring out what details to put in there, and then just building everything up. So once I got the squares put in, then I started filling everything else in. Obviously there are still gaps that will be filled in later, but we're not going to to worry about those right now. Next, I'm going to start filling in the sand and then working on all the little details around. As you can see here, I basically finished up the landing pad. There's a few more small gaps I have to fill, and I'll figure out what to do with that later. There might be some bits of destroyed landing pad, sand covering the parts I absolutely cannot cover up, but this looks really good. I'm very happy with it. And now we're going to move on to filling in all of this around the landing pad and making all the sand in the grassy areas. So let's move on to that. Now that the landing pad is mostly complete, you can see I'm raising everything by a plate so I can start placing the sand, which will then lead into me adding the details later in the video. I also have to raise everything by a plate so the elevation of the sand is one plate higher than the landing pad, and that's because I want to add sand details onto the landing pad. I also have to do this for the first base plate so the elevations of the sand and the grass make sense. Here we have the fully plated off beach around the landing pad, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add in sand around the edges and fill in the grass bits, which will help it blend in more to its surroundings and make it feel more like Scarif. That being said, let's get into that. I combine all the base plates together to work on the frame, and I also wanted to do this to get a full view of how it's going to look when it's finally completed. I started also adding the details on the base plates where this landing pad is, and that's because I just want to see how it looks. I'm not entirely happy with it, so there's definitely going to be changes coming to everything in the next episode, including raising the elevation in the first plate, changing the grass details, and adding the sand around the border. So that being said, let's take a final look at what we've done this week. As you can see from the time lapse, I spent a lot of time fiddling around with these grassy areas. I'm not entirely happy with them, but they can always be changed in the future. But I just wanted to get a basic idea of how they're gonna look. I do want them to end up looking more like this, more spread out, flatter, instead of as steep as this one is. This one's good and will be continued over because it continues into the next base plate. And I decided to start adding sand around. There's going to be a lot more sand added. I'm going to do snot bricks here, along the edges, to really to put wedge plates and really give off that the sand is starting to spill onto the landing pad. And yeah, that's going to be it for today's update. Let's get into the outro. As previously mentioned, next week is going to be working a lot on the bunker. There's also going to be work on raising the first base plate up by a plate and adding all the little details and finishing everything off. So it'll all look almost as complete as it would for the finale next week. If I don't get all of that done next week, which I'm anticipating not, then I'm going to have to release a 5th update, which will then be the finale. And I also want to do a cinematic video and a time-lapse video, just showcasing the MOC and showing the whole process along the way. And that's going to wrap up today's video. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe. I hope you all have a safe and wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next video.